And here you can see the plan of the European Union, how we would like in Europe to achieve this goal. You see where we are or where we were 10 years ago and where we have to go. So there's quite a dramatic way to go because the decarbonization is for the European Union still the main goal which we would like to achieve within the next 30 years. You can also see who are the biggest contributors to the greenhouse emissions. This is first of all the power production, the electricity and other power production, then the industry, then the transport. And then also agriculture contributes quite substantially to the net emissions. So, this is the plan which Professor Lung mentioned in her introduction. We would like to achieve until 2030 a reduction of 30%, excuse me, of 40%, but the so-called ETS areas where the power production and the industry and the aviation sector is part of it, these parts have to contribute 43% and the rest has to contribute 30%. So that together it results in a 40% decrease. I can also tell you, you maybe know that there is a change going on in the European institutions. There's a new president coming in, Mrs. von der Leyen, and she says this is not ambitious enough. She promised that she will suggest or make a proposal within her first 100 days in office, and she starts in November, that until 2030, the decrease of greenhouse gas emissions is not 40%, but 50%. So you can see we have something to do in the coming years to come at least close to this aim. She is right in principle, because if we are not able to go for 50% until more or less 2030, then we can no longer achieve the other goal, the decarbonization goal for 2050. What does this mean for the agricultural sector? The agricultural sector represents 12% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the European Union. On the other hand, the agricultural sector is one of the most vulnerable sectors from all economic sectors, because most of the production is going on outside, outdoor, and not indoor. Here, I don't explain the details here, but just that you get a bit an impression. First of all, the problems within the European Union are not everywhere the same. The biggest problems are in the south of the European Union, where you have more water scarcity, more abnormal weather conditions, and so on and so forth. So the risks are in the south bigger than in the north or in the middle. In the very north, these regions could even gain from the climate change, at least for some decades. And in the middle, you must differentiate between the east and the west, because the west has a more a climate which is more influenced by the Atlantic, and the east is a more continental climate. So therefore, the effects are not everywhere the same. And you can see, if you look at these arrows, where the arrow is going up, it's going up, the effect is going up, or in the other way, it is going down. So, what are the driving forces behind these changes and behind the food production sector? The effects are mainly driven, first of all, by changes in the precipitations, so more or less rain, for example, then the temperature changes, the severity and periodicity of the extreme events, also to some degree the rise in the sea level and the increase of CO2 concentration, which is the so-called greenhouse effect. If you increase the CO2 concentration in a greenhouse to some degree, then the yields are higher and not lower. And this effect is also to some degree can be observed also in nature. So, how to mitigate? First of all, there is the issue of farming practices. As I said, agriculture is producing a lot of direct emissions. For instance, if you think about how we treat our manure or how we treat the residues of agriculture, or there are many other direct emissions which play a role here, especially also depending on the crop management method, you produce more or less CO2. And then there's this important issue of carbon sink. Carbon is stored in the soils, and it depends very much on the soil management to what degree this management is positive or negative for the soils. For example, in Austria, we have an area where, for the moment, there are about 300 farmers which went together voluntarily and introduced a better soil management system. And the effect of this new soil management is that you can store on this land per year additional 10 tons of CO2. So this is an enormous effect. If you multiply this with the million hectares which we are cultivating, then one could store by bringing up the organic carbon in the soil to a natural level. I mentioned that it is everywhere below at the moment. If we would bring this up to the natural level, this would be the biggest contribution of the agricultural sector to the solution, to the problem of climate change. Then the other big issue is biomass. And here, this is not only related to agricultural production, here forestry plays an enormous role, because you can store huge quantities in the trees, but also in the soils in the forest. And both together can help really to change the situation. From the Club of Rome, some experts are of the opinion that this is, globally speaking, the best way to deal with climate change. The pity is it takes time. And you can also argue why don't we then start immediately with afforestation measures instead of accepting further deforestation? Then the reduction of fossil fuel intensive ag production, this has to do a lot with fertilization, because artificial fertilizers are based on fossil energy, and in addition also the crop management. The more you use the plow, the more energy intensive the method is, the more you do low or non-tillage production, you introduce low or no tillage production methods, the better it is. And then finally, the question of the production losses and waste. You know that we wouldn't have a problem in the world to feed 10 billion people. But the problem in reality is that about 25% to 1/3 of the total production is either lost or wasted. And if we don't change this, then we can neither feed the world in the future, nor are we able to reduce in the to the necessary degree the situation. So this is in addition what I showed you before. It's again the carbon cycle, but here only limited to the agricultural effects. So you see here the methane production coming from the cattle or from other animals, or also from the manure of the animals. You see the management of the soils and the effects, the fertilization, but then also what is going on in the forest. What we have achieved so far in the European Union, you can see here. So there's a slight decrease in the greenhouse gas emissions, but here we must do much more and we must go further. There are different threats to the European soils. This is the organic matter decline. We spoke about it. This is also the soil erosion. So I think we touched upon all these elements. And you can see here how different also the situation is in the European Union. So the organic carbon content in the soils is more negative in the south and in the east. In the east, because these are the countries where communistic crop management system happened over decades, and this was much less successful. And here you see the soil erosion risk. This is clearly higher in the south, but almost not existent in the north. What I would like to say here with this slide is not that I explain it to give you a lengthy explanation. The idea is that for us in the European Union, it is clear that we must change our common agricultural policy. And these are the actions and the goals which are already on the table, which are under negotiations, and where we hope that a decision will follow next year. Apart from the direct necessary measures, there are also general measures which are very important, education, research, and so on. You know this. So I must go a bit faster. Let's speak for the last 5 to 10 minutes about what's going on in the seas. Here you can see what's happening and what affects the higher concentration of greenhouse gases and the higher surface temperatures have on our marine systems. I must confess that we don't know as much as we know about the land-based systems about the ocean. There is a lot of additional research necessary to better understand the different effects. The main things which we can see is the degradation of the ecosystem services, then the increase of the sea level, 25 centimeters over the last 140 years, and then the increasing temperature. I mentioned already that the coral reefs will disappear, and the effect of all this for the fishery sector is that in developing countries, this is an estimation made by the WWF, Europe could be 50% less in the annual catches and overall 35%. So, and the decreasing pH stability or the acidization of the sea threatens also organisms, especially shellfish. You see here in this picture exactly what I mentioned a minute ago. And then there's another point which is very important, but we don't know so far much about this point, therefore I just mention it. And this is that there's the risk that the ocean currents could change in the future. For example, the Gulf Stream in the Atlantic. So there has a lot to be done, and we cannot so much influence what's going on in the sea. We must live with the consequences. In other words, there is no alternative than to adapt to this new situation. And for that, it is clear what is needed is a proper stock policy, a proper monitoring of the fish stocks, and based on these scientific findings to fix then the catch quotas. This is the way how we try to deal with the consequences. We in Europe, we have for each box in the sea a catch quota fixed every year, and every year there's a monitoring done so that we know precisely the stock development, not only the amount of the stock, but also, for example, the age classes and also the different species. So, on the if it's unavoidable that we have to reduce the fishing activities, and we have also maybe to reduce first the fishing effort, then we must offer to the fishing communities, to the fishermen, also other alternatives to make sure that they have a reasonable livelihood in the future. These are some of the recommendations which we have in the European Union. So as I said, science-based targets for stock management, then an ecosystem-based approach for the governance, and then the fishery management adapted to the stocks or to the stock development, and then also a dispute a mechanism to solve fishing right disputes, which are going on almost everywhere. And then we must go for more aquaculture and produce more farmed fish and not so much wild fish. This was it. Thank you very much.